In July 1945, the USS Indianapolis, a Portland-class heavy cruiser, was assigned a top-secret mission that would place it at the heart of one of the most tragic naval disasters in American history. The ship was tasked with delivering critical components of the atomic bomb, Little Boy, including a uranium-235 projectile and other parts, to Tinian Island. These materials were essential for the bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima just days later. The ship completed the mission on July 26, 1945, making a record-setting voyage from San Francisco to Tinian in just 10 days. After delivering the cargo, the Indianapolis was ordered to sail to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines to prepare for the expected invasion of Japan. Because of the mission's classified nature, her movement went unreported, and no one expected her arrival until several days later. This left the ship without escort and invisible to tracking systems, conditions that would prove disastrous. At approximately 12:15 a.m. on July 30th, while sailing through the Philippine Sea, the Indianapolis was struck by two torpedoes launched by Japanese submarine Richards 58, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto. The first torpedo hit the bow, blowing it off and igniting fuel stores. The second struck amidships near a powder magazine, causing a massive secondary explosion. The explosion knocked out power, communications, and ruptured watertight compartments. Within 12 minutes, the ship had capsized and sunk. Many crew members were trapped below deck. Those who escaped were thrown into the sea, some burned, many without life vests, and few with access to lifeboats. Of the 1,196 crew aboard, about 900 made it into the water alive. The survivors found themselves scattered across miles of open ocean. Most were floating alone or in small clusters. Some clung to life rafts or debris, while others had only their Kapok life jackets. With no distress signal sent and no one aware the ship had gone down, the men were left without rescue or support for days. By the morning of July 30th, the sun was already punishing. Temperatures soared past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Dehydration set in quickly. Some sailors resorted to drinking seawater, which led to salt poisoning, hallucinations, and in many cases, death. Wounds became infected, and fuel oil from the sinking ship coated many of the survivors, irritating skin and eyes. Oceanic white-tip sharks, known for their aggressive behavior and tendency to circle shipwrecks, began appearing shortly after dawn. They were drawn by the blood, the movement, and the sheer volume of men in the water. Survivors initially hoped the sharks would pass, but within hours, attacks began. The predators targeted isolated individuals and wounded men first. Survivors described seeing men pulled underwater in a flash, screams abruptly cut off, and bodies reappearing with limbs missing. The attacks were constant. Some men tried to punch the sharks or splash to scare them off, but nothing worked. Those in groups had slightly better odds, but the sharks were undeterred by numbers. Survivors rotated from the outside of the cluster inward to give everyone a chance to rest. But even this system offered little safety. As one survivor later stated, the sharks were always there. You'd feel them bump into you. Sometimes you'd see the fins coming, sometimes you wouldn't. By the second day, the situation had deteriorated dramatically. The sun, lack of food, and untreated injuries were taking their toll. The seawater-induced hallucinations became more intense. Some men imagined rescue ships or food. Others believed the sharks were illusions, or that they were back home. Many men died from exposure or despair. Others lost their minds, removing their life jackets and attempting to swim away. Some attacked their fellow sailors in confusion. As bodies accumulated, the sharks became more frenzied. Survivors had to push corpses away from the group to reduce attacks. Some men clung to floating bodies, hoping they would serve as decoys. The lack of fresh water was the most devastating factor. Rain fell briefly on the second day, and some men managed to catch a few mouthfuls. Others stared at the sky, praying for more. By the third day, the survivors' numbers had thinned. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction. The dead floated among the living. Men lost hope. The hallucinations became darker. Some men thought their friends were enemies. Some believed sharks were people trying to help. One group of survivors aboard a half-submerged raft tried to organize shifts and encourage each other. keeping track of time as best they could. A few still held on to hope. Others had already given up. The sharks continued their attacks. Survivors described them as deliberate and efficient. They seemed to know which men were weakest. The dorsal fins circled, vanished, then chaos would erupt. On August 2nd, at around 10:25 a.m., a PV-1 Ventura bomber, piloted by Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn, spotted an oil slick and then the heads of survivors bobbing in the water. He flew lower and confirmed what he was seeing. Dozens of men scattered across the ocean. He immediately dropped a radio buoy and alerted his base. Lieutenant Adrian Marks, piloting a PBY Catalina flying boat, was dispatched to the scene. Seeing the condition of the survivors, he made the risky decision to land his aircraft on the open sea, which was not designed for such use in rough water. He and his crew pulled 56 men aboard, laying them across the wings and inside the fuselage. Meanwhile, the USS Cecil J. Doyle and other ships were dispatched to the area. Doyle arrived around midnight and used searchlights to illuminate the water, helping rescue more survivors and providing a morale boost. By the end of the operation, 316 men had been rescued alive. The rescued men were in appalling condition. Many were covered in oil. Others had open wounds teeming with infection. Some were blind due to exposure or fuel damage to their eyes. Many had severe sunburn, dehydration, and signs of organ failure. Amputations were necessary in several cases. Survivors were taken to field hospitals and Navy installations for recovery. The U.S. Navy quickly launched an investigation. Despite the systemic communication failures that delayed rescue, the focus shifted to Captain Charles B. McVeigh III. He was charged with failing to zigzag, a maneuver designed to make ships harder to hit by submarines. During the court-martial, even the Japanese commander who had sunk the Indianapolis, Lieutenant Commander Hashimoto, testified that zigzagging would not have changed the outcome. Nevertheless, McVeigh was convicted. Many believed he was used as a scapegoat to protect Navy leadership and deflect attention from their errors. McVeigh's conviction haunted him. Though he remained in the Navy until retiring as a Rear Admiral, he received hate mail for decades from families of the dead. In 1968, he died by suicide. The story of the Indianapolis was largely overshadowed by the end of the war and the atomic bomb. But in the decades that followed, survivors fought to clear McVeigh's name. In 1996, a 6th grade student named Hunter Scott reignited public interest by conducting a project on the incident and presenting it to Congress. The efforts led to a formal investigation and bipartisan support for McVeigh's exoneration. In 2000, Congress passed a resolution clearing his name, and President Bill Clinton signed it into law. The Navy officially removed the conviction from McVeigh's record. The attacks during the Indianapolis disaster are considered the deadliest shark attacks on humans in history. Experts estimate that around 150 of the 900 initial survivors were killed by sharks. The predominant species involved was the oceanic whitetip, with tiger sharks also likely responsible. Oceanic whitetips are opportunistic predators known to follow ships and investigate disturbances. Their aggressive behavior and habitat in open ocean make them particularly dangerous in such situations. In the case of the Indianapolis, the large number of vulnerable humans in the water presented a rare and deadly opportunity for these predators. Of the 1,196 men aboard the USS Indianapolis, only 316 survived. Nearly 600 died from exposure, dehydration, and saltwater poisoning. An estimated 150 were killed by sharks. The rest were lost in the initial explosion or sank with the ship. The sinking of the Indianapolis remains a case study in wartime tragedy, compounded by communication, failure, and administrative oversight. The courage of the survivors, the brutality of the conditions, and the lessons learned continue to resonate through naval history. Today, memorials stand in several cities, and survivors reunite to honor their fallen comrades. Their story is taught in military academies and serves as a warning about the cost of complacency and the unforgiving nature of war at sea. In the early 1800s, Nantucket was more than a dot on the map. It was the engine of America's whaling industry. Whale oil lit the homes of New York and Boston. It greased factory wheels, powered street lamps, and filled the coffers of ship owners. But the men who harvested it faced grueling, unforgiving conditions. They weren't just sailors, they were hunters, risking everything to harvest a beast that could shatter boats with its tail. The Essex, a 238-ton whale ship, departed Nantucket in August 1819. She was neither the largest nor the fastest, but she was seasoned. This voyage would take her into the Pacific Ocean for 2 to 3 years. There was an unease surrounding the Essex even before she left port. Some called her overdue for a reckoning. She was already over 20 years old, battered by earlier voyages, and had once been blown off course for weeks during a storm in the Atlantic. Before the 1819 voyage, a sudden squall broke her topgallant mast just days from Nantucket. An omen, some said. A veteran sailor refused to reboard after repairs, muttering that the ship would not come back the same way she left. Still, those aboard dismissed such talk. Men who chase whales for a living don't scare easily. But what no one could know, not Pollard, not Chase, not the green deckhands below, was that they were sailing straight towards their demise. On board were 21 men, including Captain George Pollard, only 29 and commanding his first ship. First mate Owen Chase, just a few years older, was driven and precise, with a reputation for discipline. There was also young Owen Coffin, Pollard's cousin, just 17. He had never been to sea. Many aboard hadn't. Their world was cramped and loud. Below deck, the men lived among barrels of salted meat, ropes, canvas, and the ever-present reek of oil and sweat. On deck, it was constant labor, scrubbing, repairing sails, coiling line, and scanning the endless ocean for the white spout of a whale. The whaling process was brutal. When a whale was sighted, the men launched small, fragile boats into the sea, armed with harpoons and lances. A struck whale could dive for miles, dragging the boat behind in what was called a Nantucket sleigh ride. Then came the kill, the gutting, and the grisly process of rendering the blubber in giant iron pots. Burns, injuries, and infections were constant risks. It was work for the desperate or the determined. By November 1820, the Essex had made modest progress in the South Pacific, over 1,000 miles west of South America. On November 20th, the crew spotted a large pod of sperm whales. As 3 whaleboats gave chase, a giant bull whale, unusually large, possibly 85 feet, approached the main ship. The whale moved with eerie focus. It struck the Essex bow with a thunderous impact. Then, as stunned sailors watched, it turned and rammed the ship again. The blow was catastrophic. The bow splintered. Water poured in. Chase and Pollard watched in disbelief as the Essex began to founder. With little time, they salvaged what they could: navigational instruments, dried biscuits, casks of water, and whatever supplies weren't submerged. They crammed these into 3 25-foot whaleboats, never meant for long voyages. There was no sailcloth for shade, no weapons, and no means of communication. Just open boats in the vast Pacific. Pollard proposed heading west to the Marquesas, just over 1,000 miles away. But stories of islander cannibalism, exaggerated or not, made the men balk. They chose instead to sail south, then east, hoping to reach the coast of South America. It added hundreds of miles to their journey and weeks of exposure to sun and sea. What followed was a slow collapse of order, health, and hope. The sun baked their skin to leather. Salt water soaked their clothes, opening sores. Drinking water became the obsession. The barrels they had salvaged were few, and some had been tainted by seawater. Their food, mostly hardtack biscuits, became infested with salt and mold. Meals were doled out crumb by crumb. The boats were vulnerable. One was damaged and constantly took on water, requiring a man to bail continuously. At night, temperatures dropped sharply. Sleep was nearly impossible. The men began to drift in and out of delirium. Some saw hallucinations. Some cried out for family. Others simply grew silent. On December 20th, a month after the Essex sank, the men spotted Henderson Island. It seemed like salvation. They hauled ashore and gorged on birds, shellfish, and fresh water from a tiny spring. But the island was too small and barren. It couldn't support them for long. After a week, the decision was made. 17 would head back to sea in search of rescue. 3, too weak or unwilling, remained behind. They were later rescued. The rest rode into deeper despair. Within weeks, one boat was lost entirely, vanishing into stormy seas. No trace of it was ever found. The remaining boats drifted far apart. Men began to die. The survivors faced a terrible choice. They turned to the only source of nourishment left, their dead crewmates. Bodies were stripped, flesh cut into strips and dried in the sun. Organs were eaten first. Bones were cracked for marrow. It was methodical, horrifying, and necessary. One man, Isaac Cole, began to lose his mind. He was restrained, but soon died. On Pollard's boat, no one had yet succumbed. They decided to draw lots. Owen Coffin, the young cousin Pollard had sworn to protect, drew the short straw. He accepted his fate calmly. His friend Charles Ramsdell fired the shot. They ate what they had to. Pollard never forgave himself. Meanwhile, Chase's boat, equally gaunt and skeletal, drifted into the path of a passing ship, the Indian, on January 23rd. Only 3 aboard were still alive. A second ship, the Dauphin, discovered Pollard and Ramsdell 2 weeks later, barely alive, surrounded by human bones. They had been at sea for over 90 days. Of the 21 men who sailed from the Essex, only 8 survived. The 3 left on Henderson Island were later found and rescued. When they returned to Nantucket, the town struggled to process the story. Cannibalism was taboo, but the facts were undeniable. These were not savages. They were neighbors, sons, brothers. The community met their return with a quiet, uncomfortable sympathy. Owen Chase published a detailed account of the voyage, titled Narrative of the Most Extraordinary and Distressing Shipwreck of the Whale Ship Essex. It became a sensation. Melville read it years later and wove its core into Moby Dick. He would later visit Chase's widow and son in Nantucket. Captain Pollard's story was darker. He never sailed again. His second ship wrecked early in its voyage, seen by some as a sign. He returned home in disgrace. He took work as a night watchman and faded from public life. Each year on the anniversary of Owen Coffin's death, he would fast alone in his room. Chase fared better. He continued to sail, but struggled with nightmares and migraines. In later years, he developed severe paranoia and was eventually confined to his attic, where he hoarded food obsessively. The legacy of the Essex endures because it strips human nature down to its rawest form. Civilization fell away. What remained was instinct, survival, and guilt. The whale was not a monster. It was just defending itself. But the sea was relentless. It devoured ships, erased trails, and pushed men to the edge of humanity. The Essex wasn't just lost to the ocean, it was sacrificed to the cost of ambition, isolation, and the fragility of human order when nature stops playing fair. Today, the Essex is remembered not for how she died, but for what her survivors had to become in order to live.